Well, good morning, everyone. It's also fun to see all of you. I'm really starting to get to know some of your faces from Masechta to Masechta. It's really, really wonderful to be together. Welcome. We are going through the daf from this week, daf 65 to 72. We will begin on 65. My style is I'm just going to kind of run through daf by daf, different highlights on every page. The chat does not distract me. Feel free, as Rob and everyone who comes to the daily daf knows, you can go ahead and put questions in the chat, comments, or even puns, anything that you're inspired to put in the chat, you're welcome to do. This was quite an interesting week in Masechet Ketubot land. We saw a number of Agaritas, famous stories in the Talmud, in addition to some very interesting legal material that we'll address as we go. Right on the top of daf 65 is where we're going to begin. Even the first few words of this daf are fascinating. It says, Ein poskin yenot liisha. One should not give a woman wine. Right? We talked about what are the different things that a man in Jewish law is responsible to provide for his bride, for his wife. One of them, there's this discussion of sustenance, right? Well, what's in that category? Well, we got into this whole discussion of the status of wine and should you give a woman wine? Now, what I thought was very interesting about this section of the Gemara is that it really explored the question of female sexuality. Right? It started to really ask questions of, do women have desire? And if they are given wine, can we trust, right, that they won't go out and be with other men? And so that was the whole discussion there. We saw that a number of times this week, this question of desire and halacha and women, which is very interesting. And we know from Pesach, the idea of 4 cups of wine, right? Well, we saw 4 cups of wine also in this week's daf, this idea that 4 cups of wine is beyond what she is allowed to demand in this particular situation. We also talked about when you have a ketubah, what kalim, what objects should be included in the stipulations for the ketubah. It'll be really interesting, to see in the chat, like what are the top things that you think should be included in a ketubah, in the legal document of the husband's responsibilities to his wife. Well, on daf 65, we talked about a bed and a mat and a mattress, some of the standard things that a woman would be obligated or the man would be obligated to provide for the woman. I'm wondering if anyone else experienced this week while they were going through the daf, a kind of moment. I had a moment this week where I said, oh my gosh, this is almost like a professional relationship, right? She provides her earnings. He provides food for her. He provides other stuff for her. He provides conjugal relations. She provides certain tasks, right? There's like this very explicit financial arrangement that's going on, economic arrangement. And then, of course, we see these little hints about love and marriage and relationship. But on this week's daf, yeah, Larry, amazing, a joint venture, right? It was like, this is actually what they're entering into. So there's a contract. The ketubah is not only a contract, lest the marriage dissolve and she needs to be supported, but it's also a contract with stipulations that support the daily back and forth of this joint venture, right? So interesting, this marriage as a business venture. Now, there was this back and forth. Well, what is she entitled to? Different kinds of bed, pillow, blanket, whatever it is. And really interestingly, we see clothing enter the picture at the end of daf 65. Why does she get clothing only once a year, but shoes for every festival? And we said actually that clothing and shoes is relative, right? They are relative, that in places that are mountainous, shoes wear out more quickly than clothing, right? So actually, when it comes to the stipulations of support in the ketubah, you're getting to questions that are really about subjectivity, what a person requires in a particular region. And I'm looking in the chat, Rachel is saying that we discussed this idea on the very first page of the tractate. I guess I was slacking off on my reading, on my Jewish learning reading. But
No, that was for everyone if they wanted to review, but we discussed this the way that Tractate Ketubot really is has a very contractual view of marriage,
Yes.
which of course, like this is the Talmud is legal, so we'd expect them to lean into the legal side of marriage, but yes, it can get very, I don't know that that's not true today, depending on the context in which you discuss marriage. So,
oh my gosh, any good couples therapist will probably tell you, you are in a joint venture together, right? Like it's not only about love and relationship on a relational level, interpersonal level, but there's also a real, your partners and creating something in the world, and that requires responsibilities as well. More obligations of the husband. Okay, what does it mean she eats with him every Friday night? There was a debate. Does it literally mean they have Shabbos dinner, or does it mean they have sex every Friday night? Right, so we talked about that on Daf 65 as well. We talked about, is it a euphemism or not? We discussed also wine when it comes to a nursing mother. Right. And something that's very interesting is we landed on the idea in the Gemara that nursing women, it's good for them to drink a lot of alcohol. Right. Now, Dr. Jeremy Brown, who some of you might read his blog, very incredible blog, Talmudology. Has anyone seen that blog before? He goes through science on the Daf. He's a doctor himself. And so he goes through different ideas from science and the Gemara. And he, on that day, goes through this question of alcohol and nursing. Very interesting. Okay. Now, what about privileges? Now that we've talked about the things that a wife can demand from the husband, what can the man demand from his wife? Well, we talked about mitzios, findings, earnings, all of these things. Well, one thing that stood out from the beginning of the next perek on the bottom of Daf 65 is that even though most payments go to the husband, if one embarrasses or wounds a woman, the payments go to her, right? Her. There was a debate about if those payments go to him, if it is like a visible, some sort of injury, and therefore he also takes part in some of the embarrassment and shame. But that's quite interesting that even though he generally does receive the payments that are due to her, that's not true when it comes to her own pain and personal embarrassment. We talked about this idea of the basic earnings versus the extra earnings. And while this doesn't feel contemporary in some ways, the wife gives all of her earnings to the husband, I do think it's not very, very long ago that this changed, right? There was the idea of if she had financial control in the marriage or not. What we start to get a sense of in this week's Daf is she actually can maintain financial control with her extra earnings, right? There's going to be ways in which she can go around some of these laws to hold her earnings. Even just on yesterday's Daf, we talked about what if she makes a ton of money and she wants to say, why don't I take care of my own food and keep my earnings, right? So there's a way that, if you're getting married in these ancient times, you might hit up a sage for some advice and say, how can I keep my money, right, in this marriage and just support myself? And that would be possible in some ways. All right, let's move on. We're on Daf 66. I'm flying through here discussing appraising the dowry. Okay, so if the father of a girl, a woman, pledges to give a dowry and the husband dies before Nisuin, before the marriage actually finishes taking place, the father can tell the Yavam. Remember the Yavam, right? The Yavam is the surviving brother of the deceased man. The father can tell him, according to the Mishnah, I wanted to give it to your brother, but I don't want to give it to you, right? So I'm highlighting that because we talked about this really interesting situation because of Yibum, because of levirate marriage, where the father is given a dowry and it ends up in a marriage or in a person who he doesn't expect for it to land in, which is really quite interesting. Now, what about a wife who brings money into the marriage? She can keep some of it, but much of it goes into what's going on in terms of the husband's support. Now we take a turn in the Gemara. This is a very famous set of stories on bottom of Daf 66 and 67, where we learn about the laws of tzedakah, the laws of charity, actually from this very sad story of the daughter of Naktimon ben Gurion actually becoming, once having had been wealthy, now in this very, very sorry state, we turn to many stories about people who give tzedakah well, people who don't give tzedakah very well at all. And this is an awesome little set of Gemaras for Elul as we get ready for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because in just not a few short weeks, what am I saying? Less than 10 days, right? We're going to actually stand together in Shul and Rosh Hashanah. We're going to say the Unetana Tokef prayer, this very, very beautiful and moving piyut liturgical poem. And we're going to say Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, repentance, prayer, and charity. Ma'avirin et ro'ah hagezerah, avert the evil of the decree. This Gemara teaches us what tzedakah really is, right? What is it? It's not actually sometimes what we imagine it to be, where you just like put a coin in a tzedakah box or whatever. No, it's actually very complicated to do properly. It involves a lot of intentionality around not embarrassing someone and being able to give enough, being able to give according to what a person is actually used to, which is not necessary. It's very countercultural, right? We say that if they're used to a horse, give them a horse. If they're used to an eved, a slave, well, then if there's no slave around, then that sage will go ahead and perform that duty, right? I mean, this is not the kind of tzedakah that we say, well, let me see your bank statements before I give you some money. No. It's about maintaining dignity in a very, very radical way. And there was a story in the Gemara about different chachamim, different sages who gave tzedakah, who gave charity. There was one poor person in Mar Ukva's neighborhood. And each day, Mar Ukva used to throw coins into the hole in the pivot area of the dvor. Now, this story, I think, is great because one day, the man decides to try to see where the tzedakah was coming from. And on that day, it happened to be that Mar Ukva's wife was going with him. Has anyone ever done like service acts on a date or something? Like they go with their partner to go give some tzedakah or pack some food or whatever it is. That's what's happening, this couple. Now, when the man saw that they were approaching the door, the poor person ran after Mar Ukva and his wife. And so there's this chase going on. And what happens is they try to flee, and they find it so important to have to flee that they jump into a furnace. Okay, they jump into a furnace, and Mar Ukva's feet were getting burnt. He was getting burnt. His legs were getting burnt. And his wife seems to be fine. Her feet were not actually getting burnt. And then his wife is like, you can put your legs on mine. I'm fine. I have more merit than you because I'm used to actually giving charity every day. Food where the people can enjoy it immediately. Wow. Okay. Now, here's the message that's been sitting with me all week from this story. Sometimes if you give charity in these like really excessive, showy ways, not every day and in small ways, it can burn you. You can burn out, right? From this kind of charity, this kind of like big showy charity. But Mar Ukva's wife, you know what she did every day? She would basically imagine that the poor were a part of her family. Why don't you come in for some lunch? And so her feet don't get burned. And I think the question of tzedakah has the capacity to cause burning or burnout is very interesting. And it also has the capacity not to. And you can see from the story of Mar Ukva and his wife that there are different ways to understand that. Okay, so more stories about sages giving tzedakah in a humble and dignified way. Any questions in the chat? Want to put them in? I'm just looking in the chat here, settling. Interesting. So Jennifer says maybe the whole negotiation with the ketubah in general can actually bring something out in the process that might cause the families to say, never mind, right? For sure. I actually think that's a really interesting point. Yeah. Talmudology, I see that. Very good. An interesting point from Aaron. I don't understand why it's good that a privileged person should have that privilege supported by the community. It's a very good question. Like, why don't we work towards a situation where everyone is more equal? Why don't we do that? Well, I don't know. Think about it. Think about theologically what that means. We seem to say you started rich, stay rich, like just because you're poor right now, we want to support the way of life you once had. I think sometimes one thing that's uncomfortable to think about is that the Torah reflects a reality that there will always be rich and always be poor, right? So it's like the Torah is weird. It's like this mixture of socio-capitalism, agricultural, there's like a number of different isms in there, right? But this is one of those moments where we say, well, why don't we just level the playing field, right? That's not what's happening here in this particular set of stories and halachas. Okay.
I'm not sure radical equality is the goal of the Torah.
Good point. I mean, we see like glimpses of it, right? We see Shabbos, there's supposed to be radical equality. Shemitah, Yovel, like the Shemitah and Jubilee year, there's radical equality, but just for a moment.
There's not letting anybody fall below a certain floor, right? But I'm not sure leveling everybody else out. Argue with me if you guys think I'm wrong. That's my intuition.
I mean, it's clear, right? From the Psukim and from, it's not, that doesn't mean we don't work towards it. Right. I think that what's really interesting, and I'm just going to skip around a little bit and share something with you about inheritance. According to the dafs that we've just learned this week, how does inheritance work? Does any money go to the daughters? Generally, you can put it in the chat. What's the answer? Any money go to the daughters when you have let's say you have 2 sons and a daughter in your will, what goes to the daughters? So Rob says, well, she gets a dowry. She gets 10% of the estate if she is not yet married, right? But actually, it goes to the sons, unless there are no sons, in which case it goes to the daughter or daughters. Now, what's really interesting, and the reason I'm bringing this up now, is that over the generations, the rabbis and sages realized that this was totally a bad idea. Even though it says it in the Torah, that the Bechor, the firstborn boy, should receive a double portion, and then no women don't receive a portion, and even the wife doesn't necessarily always receive it, right? So over time, interesting, there's a Rambam, Maimonides, who says this is gonna be rife for disagreement. We have to fix this. And so we have all these halachic workarounds to make it possible for biblical law to square with the idea that inheritance can be equal. And that's really, really an interesting thing, because sometimes we take the verses in the Torah and we create all sorts of what's called ha'aramas. I'm just going to put that in the chat here. Ha'arama, that means like a sneaky workaround in halacha. We have that to make it possible to distribute inheritances equally, right? And so going back to what we were discussing before, maybe this idea of making everybody rich who was once rich is not something we try to aim for anymore. But there is a concept that a person should be maintained on the level of dignity that they are used to, right? That is really, really important. And I mean, all we have to do is think about, there's like so many conflicts and discussions about food stamps in the United States and what you can spend it on and all these questions. I know not everybody here is from the States, but it's a major question. And there's this idea about like policing what it is that you're allowed to purchase with public funds, and wondering if that's really a Jewish value, right? Okay, sorry for that wild digression. But going through on Daf 68, we talk about the dowry of an orphan. Now, remember that when Koren or any translation of the Talmud says orphan, it means a girl without a father. It doesn't mean a girl without parents. It's talking about the father not being around. And what happens if the father's not around and the mother or brothers write her a dowry that's less than what she really deserves? She can actually go back and demand more, which is quite interesting. We discussed the question of, well, what would her father have wanted? That was a question, right? I mean, this is a question that some of us might have dealt with in our lives when we're trying to figure out the wishes of the deceased, right? Well, what would they have wanted in this situation? Ultimately, where we land, lehalacha, according to Jewish law, is no, forget about the what would dad would have wanted. Like, we forget about that. We're just going to say it's 1/10. I'm sorry, 10%, right, of the estate. That's what she gets for her ketubah. That's what she gets for her dowry. We talked about the differences between parnasa, being supported, and food, that they're actually different things. And you can collect on those two items from different kinds of property. Daughters can seize property to collect for their parnasa, for their dowry, but not for food sustenance. That's something we talked about as well. This is a great review and a reminder that usually in Jewish law, there can be a lien on properties that actually leave the possession of the original owner. And if this original owner owed someone money or owed someone a dowry, whatever it is, the person who they owed money to can actually collect from that land. It's not even in their possession anymore. So it's important to remember that there are different kinds of ways to collect on debts also in Jewish law. Also on yesterday's daf, we discussed this idea of nedarim, right? Of what's the word? Vows, right? And we're coming up on Kol Nidre. So it's another really interesting connection. The vows, how to deal with what happens. And last night in Daf, one of our Dafers, I wonder if she's here now, Betsy, said something really, really interesting. She said, the situation was, I want you all to imagine that Rachel and I are in a car on a road trip, even though I don't know that we've ever met in person. Have we met in person, Rachel, ever? I don't think so. But now we're on a road trip, okay? And it happened to be that many moons ago, I took a vow, to never benefit from anything Rachel wants to give me. I took that vow, all right? Now, Rachel has an amazing snack bag in the car, right, on our road trip. And I'm in this
as I always do.
Yeah, well,
so everyone knows.
Awkwardly as I also do, but something has happened disastrously that I do not have my snack bag. And now, because of my neder, because of my vow, I can't benefit from you. What have I done? And we talked about all these wild workarounds yesterday that, we should pull over and she should take the snacks out of the car and put them on the fence and declare whoever wants these snacks, come and take them. Or she should give them to Aaron in the back seat, or whatever it is. And then I can take them from Aaron. But Betsy said something beautiful. She said, isn't this a great reminder that you shouldn't be flippant with your vows when it comes to interpersonal relationships, right? This is not something that we should take lightly.
Or snacks.
We should never take snacks lightly. That is obvious to me and to everyone in the room. But especially vows. And as we're coming up on Kol Nidre, it's just an interesting thing to consider. How careful have we been with language like, I never want to talk to you again, right? Like how careful are we usually with the way that we say those kinds of things? Okay, so there's also an interesting discussion on yesterday's daf, and keep the questions coming. I'm going to take a breath after this and just talk about any questions or comments in the chat. What if someone entrusts money with someone else to give to his daughter, and the man dies, and the woman now wants to have agency over that money? And again, this is connected to the question of how strongly do we have to say, let's respect what the deceased wanted versus let's take the spirit of what he wanted, right? And pull it and bring it to what this woman needs now. So it was a very, very interesting daf, just from dowries to big legal questions to this agada, to these stories about charity. There's so much in here. I actually think that if you wanted to, you could take something out of this week's daf to use it as your inspiration for the high holidays this year. There's so much here. So let's look at the chat. Yoram, yes, it comes. So I'm looking up at Yoram's chat. I put in the chat that the word ha'arama is like a legal workaround, right? A very famous legal workaround is the eruv that allows you to carry in any place in a public area on Shabbat. The reason it is a ha'arama, a legal workaround, is because that's not a real doorway that's around the city, right? That's a bunch of wires and a pole or whatever it is. And so it is a ha'arama, right? A deception. Yoram said, does it come from the word to deceive? It absolutely does. So whenever someone says, well, that's a ridiculous trickery. Like on yesterday's daf, we learned you can imply to someone who's not Jewish to help you do something on Shabbat that you wouldn't be able to do for yourself. Well, isn't that a sneaky workaround? And the answer is yes. Sometimes we employ those within the context of our legal system to make it move, right? And to help it not be stuck within its context. Okay, going down this list of chats here. Might some of today's discussions be seen differently, according to Marky, if our patriarchs, matriarchs had more daughters? Interesting question. I don't know if there were more women kind of in the picture here in our Torah. And then Martha makes a very good point. Maybe they were there, they just weren't recorded, right? As a part of our stories, very possibly. Now, something that's very cool is that Rosh Hashanah is coming. Lots of women in the Rosh Hashanah Torah readings. It's like very clear that women and female energy, all these kinds of things, it's like surrounding Rosh Hashanah, images of God as Rachamim, a God of mercy, which is the word for mercy in Hebrew, also relates to womb, right? And also the idea of the conception and pregnancy of the world, right? That there's a lot of connection to feminine energy in the high holiday season. Okay, David says, is the ketubah itself a ha'arama, like a legal workaround? Interesting question. So the way that you could answer that question is really just gut checking to see if it feels sneaky, right? To me, it doesn't feel sneaky. It feels like a rabbinic decree to prevent men from taking marriage less than seriously, right? There's no ha'arama, there's no legal funniness that's going around. You're just trying to like slap a document in front of every man who's marrying a woman to say, watch out. Right. That's kind of what's happening with a ketubah, and also to protect the woman. Yes, absolutely. Rachel places in the chat the amazing story of the daughters of Tzlafchad who demand that Hashem changes and Moshe change divine law so that they can inherit the land as well, as long as there were no brothers. Okay. Any final questions or comments? We move very quickly through this stuff, but I hope some of it was interesting and inspiring and something you can.
I don't know how you pack that much into half an hour. It's really impressive.
Thank you. It's doing the daf, it kind of sits in you in a meaningful way. And it's amazing what we cover from week to week. Wonderful to learn with all of you today. Anyone's welcome, of course, to join our daily daf, but otherwise I will see you very soon at our next MJL party here on the Weekly Review.
Thank you, Rabbanit Fruchter. Thank you for bringing so many things, some of which we weren't able to highlight in our series to the fore, and for thinking through it in the context of this season. Sometimes when we're doing Daf Yomi at MJL, we try and do it in this evergreen way where it would read just as well on the next cycle. But, we are all, many of us are living a Jewish life as we are studying, and seeing how these pages that aren't intentionally lined up with the holiday yet reflect on it is really beautiful. And I appreciate that you did that for us today. Thank you, everybody, for your robust comments and conversation. As always, it's always nice to see your faces as well. And we'll see you tomorrow in your inbox and in this space in 1 week. Thank you, everybody. Awesome. Have a good week.
See everybody soon.
Okay.